It's funny how the woman I once considered the best part of my life ended up being the person who completely ruined what I loved the most. It wasn't always like that, of course. I remember exactly when I met her, 2 decades ago now. Her name was Eva, and she was the most amazing girl I had ever seen in my life. I met her in high school, and from the beginning we had a wonderful chemistry, and soon we became inseparable. Eva was an adventurous girl. She loved guns, and even though we didn't always think alike, I loved her madly. So it's no wonder she was on cloud 9 when we started dating. And when I asked her to marry me and she accepted, I was the happiest guy on the planet. Eva and I had a beautiful ceremony, and from there we began our life together. It wasn't long before our first daughter arrived, and then, sometime later, our second little girl. I really enjoyed my little family. Eva adored the girls. They were her source of pride and joy, just as they were mine. We were very happy, or so I thought. Unfortunately, that life of love and happiness didn't last long, because as time went by, I began to notice that something wasn't right with Eva. I don't remember exactly when, but little by little I saw how she transformed into someone very different from the cheerful, adventurous, and cool girl I had fallen in love with. Her personality changed from heaven to earth. She became anxious, moody, and distrustful. At first I thought it was a passing phase, but this only intensified as time went on. However, things came to a head when Eva tried to take her own life for the first time, and I say for the first time, because this happened several times, and I have to tell you that there are no words to describe how terrifying it can be to watch someone you love make an attempt on their own life. Your first instinct is always to protect those you love from anyone who would try to harm them, but how do you protect them from themselves? How do you do that when the person who wants to harm them is themselves? I loved Eva deeply, more than myself, so I tried to help her in every way I could. I tried to talk to her. I tried to make her happy by indulging her in everything she asked for. I took her on a trip thinking she just had too much stress, but when she swallowed a whole bottle of sleeping pills in our hotel room, I knew it had been enough. Eva survived that new suicide attempt, by sheer miracle, only because I realized it in time and the doctors were able to save her. But as soon as we arrived in our city, I admitted her to a specialized mental health center. It was there that I was told she was suffering from depression, anxiety, and other serious psychological problems. At that time, the therapist prescribed a lot of medications. I bought them all for her and made sure she took them judiciously, to the letter. For a while he got a little better, and I thought we were finding our connection again. But tragedy struck when her grandfather, whom Eva loved deeply, passed away, and that loss affected her more than she could have imagined. Her grandfather was like a father to her. It was he who instilled in her her love of guns, and he had just inherited her a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber pistol, the gun with which he taught her to shoot. However, that was only the first of a series of family tragedies Eva had to face in a short span of time that left her in a darker place than before. 2 months later, she also lost her mother in a traffic accident, and just 2 weeks later, it was the turn of her grandmother, who died of a heart attack. This accumulation of tragic events in Eva's life was too much for her. After all the progress she had made with psychological therapy and the medication she had been prescribed, she simply went downhill. I knew Eva was going through a very hard time, so I tried to be there for her in every way I could. But as much as I tried to help her out of that dark tunnel, nothing seemed to work. With each passing day, her situation got worse and worse, and that started to affect our relationship more than I could ever imagine. However, there was something that still seemed like hope in the midst of the chaos, and that was that her connection with our daughters, and the great love she felt for them, was still intact. Eva spoke of them with great love, and always expressed pride and gratitude for being their mother. My 3 girls meant everything to me. Since I married Eva and became a father to my 2 daughters, they became my world. The oldest, Valeria, was 22 and had just graduated. She had gotten a job and was in a relationship with a guy I really liked, and it looked like they were going to get married soon. On the other hand, my youngest daughter, Indira, 17, was in high school and doing quite well in her studies. I loved them more than my life itself, and for them I was determined to make things work with Eva, and we could get out of this dark moment, So I redoubled my efforts and tried to rekindle the spark between us, but I felt it was like trying to make fire with a rock instead of firewood. It was hard to accept, but after more than 25 years together, I began to understand that our marriage was over. Finally, I decided that my 48th birthday would be the time I would talk to Eva about our separation. I thought that since we were all together, it would be easier to address the issue, but the celebration did not start off in the best way, as Eva and Valeria had a fierce fight. Eva was completely against Valeria marrying her boyfriend, so much so that she even threatened to lock her up to stop her from doing so. Seeing that things were getting too heated, I decided to intervene and told Eva that she had to calm down a bit. She was furious and kept reproaching Valeria that she was too young to get married and that she had to prioritize her independence and her professional life. At that moment, I intervened and told Eva that I supported Valeria in her decision and that the most important thing for me was for her to be happy, and if happiness for her meant marrying her boyfriend, who was also a good guy, she had my blessing to do so. However, this only made my Eva angrier, and she had a terrible attitude for the rest of the day. In the end, I thought that telling her about my divorce plans that day would be a mistake, but my mind was made up. So the next day, after lunch, I told Eva that we needed to talk. When I told her of my desire to end our marriage, she didn't react in the best way. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and anger and said, "You don't want to do this, Bob, I'm warning you." I replied that I had done everything I could to make it work, but it couldn't. Our marriage had fallen apart. She became extremely upset, and in an overly high and aggressive tone of voice, she told me that she would make my life miserable if I left. It was the first time I had ever seen her like that, and her threat came as quite a shock to me. However, I stood my ground. I told her that I had made a decision, and that I hoped she could be mature about it too. We were not happy, so there was no point in dragging things out any longer. And with that said, I left the room. Shortly thereafter, Eva called a family meeting. I thought I had reconsidered our conversation and was ready to talk about the separation. But when we all sat down, my heart stopped when I saw that Eva had her grandfather's gun in her hand. Immediately, a wave of panic swept over me. Because of his long history of making attempts on his life, the first thing I thought of was that he might be able to shoot himself with the gun in front of our daughters, and just thinking about it made my blood run cold. However, I was wrong, because what Eva had in mind was even more horrible. My heart froze when I saw that she, with an expression of pure anger and evil that I had never seen on her face before, started pointing the gun at our daughters. Valeria started yelling at her to let her go, but Eva was not willing to listen. She started screaming that we were all ungrateful and directly threatened to make me pay for what I was doing. In the midst of her furious madness, Eva not only threatened me, but she told our daughters that just as she had given them life, she could take it away from them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and immediately a knot formed in my stomach. In an instant, Eva cocked the gun and pointed it at our daughters. Instinctively, I stepped between her and my girls, expecting her to shoot me, but to my horror, she didn't shoot at me. She brutally shot Valeria in the neck. At that moment, time stopped for me. I felt my heart stop immediately. I ran to my daughter, screaming her name and desperate to help her somehow. But then, Eva took advantage of that moment to shoot Indira in the back. I couldn't believe what I was experiencing. It was like being in the worst nightmare of my life, and I felt completely helpless. Now my daughters were seriously injured, and I was desperate and terrified of losing them. In the midst of the chaos, I pulled out my cell phone and called 911, backing out the door with my 2 daughters behind me. They were badly injured and needed medical attention as soon as possible. My heart was pounding and I was scared to death, not for my life, but for my daughters. But the worst part of it was that Eva didn't seem interested in shooting me. She was yelling at me to get out of the way, clearly to shoot our daughters again. She was completely out of it. It was as if this woman in front of me was someone else. We finally made it out the door and ran out of the house, but this horror movie was far from over. My youngest daughter, Indira, was losing a lot of blood, so she couldn't make much progress before she fell to the ground, so I ran to her to carry her and take her with me in my arms. It was then that I could see the fear in her eyes, before it faded. At that moment, I looked up and could see that Valeria managed to run towards the street, but my heart sank when I saw her mother running after her, pointing the gun. But before I could do anything to stop her, Eva shot her twice in the chest, and seeing that Valeria was still moving, she kept shooting at her until she ran out of ammunition. An indescribable pain invaded me as I saw my two daughters motionless on the pavement, while their mother reloaded the gun to continue attacking them. It was like seeing the devil himself manifested in that monster I once considered the love of my life. At that moment, I thought of nothing else. I just wished Eva would shoot me once and for all to end this suffering and reunite me with my daughters. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at me with a macabre smile that seemed to say, "I have made you suffer more than anyone could." I no longer saw my wife in those eyes. I only recognized a savage, merciless beast, and that filled me with an anger I had never felt in my life. But just as I was thinking of jumping on her and strangling her with my bare hands, the police arrived and ordered her to drop the gun. But she didn't do that either. But with that same smirk that never left her face, she took one last look at me, and before anyone could do anything, she placed the barrel of the gun to her temple and pulled the trigger. Her limp body slumped to the ground inches away from Valeria's. But I felt no relief. I only felt an unbridled rage that was burning inside me. She had gotten away with it in the end, managing to escape the consequences while I had to deal with this torment for the rest of my days. For 7 years, I have relived that terrifying night over and over again, and all I can think is that I should have let it go to hell that night in the hotel. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't blame myself for what happened. I always regret that my daughters had the misfortune of being born to a demon like that. Eva took everything from me and made sure I suffered eternally for it. Every time I close my eyes, I can see her face with that triumphant smile that turns my stomach every time I remember her. I have tried seeking help, going through therapy and so on, but there is no way to overcome what happened to me. I know I will live with this pain for the rest of my days, and I don't know if I will ever find peace. Hi, my name is Tammy, and I don't come here to give you the usual lecture that getting back together with an ex is the worst thing you can do in life, because in fact, I am now living with my ex and, surprisingly, I am quite happy. But life isn't always a fairy tale, and sometimes, trying to renew a connection with someone from the past can turn into a disaster. And today, I'm going to share with you one of those stories. It all started a few years ago. It had been a while since I broke up with Phil, and although it was complicated after a long time together, we knew it was the best thing for both of us. That's what we thought, and although the split was mutually agreed in the end, the reality is that he hadn't taken it too well. But after all the fights we'd had and how tense things were between us, he agreed too. However, about a year after our separation, I started receiving messages from a number I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a mistake, that it was someone clueless who had gotten the wrong contact. But the messages kept coming, and I soon realized they were from Phil. At first, they were just simple things like, "Hi, how are you?" or "I've been thinking about you," and the like. But then these messages started to take a different turn, where he started saying how much he missed me and how sorry he was about how things ended. I felt very uncomfortable with this new attention he was giving me, especially since it had been quite some time since we broke up, so I tried to ignore his messages, hoping he would eventually get bored and leave me alone. Phil was always a cool person, although at one point our differences started to take their toll, but other than that, he was never disrespectful to me. Not violent, not anything like that, so I knew he had no bad intentions, but I needed him to understand when it was time to stop. However, he did not relent in his apparent reconquest advance. His messages became more insistent and started coming at any time of the day and night. It was as if he was always aware of what I was doing, appearing on my phone just when I was alone or distracted. I tried blocking his number, but he would always find a way to contact me with someone else, and this was driving me crazy. Although at first I tried to be patient and take it easy, the truth is that at this point, the situation was already irritating me. I was fond of him, but I was no longer interested. However, Phil seemed to keep stalking me, completely robbing me of my peace of mind. At one point I began to lose sleep and was always on edge. My friends tried to help, but honestly, they couldn't do much. Phil was very insistent, and I felt that nothing I said would dissuade him, so in the end, I decided it was time to face the situation and speak up for once. I knew I was in no danger, because Phil was a good person at heart, so I chose to be direct and clear with him. I couldn't keep hiding, hoping he would just disappear and decide to make his life with someone else. I knew it was time to confront Phil to end this madness once and for all. So I told him I needed to talk to him, and we arranged to meet at a coffee shop, a place where I could have the advantage without feeling too exposed. That day was a holiday, and most coffee shops were closed, but he suggested a place near his house that he said was probably open. When I arrived, I saw that the place was indeed open, but there was no one at the tables. It was then that I saw him sitting at a little table in the corner, and when he saw me, he smiled. But for some reason, that friendly smile on his lips was not matched by the look in his eyes. He was looking at me with an intensity that made my hair stand on end. However, I decided to just ignore him and go inside. But as soon as I walked through the door, Phil stood up, walked toward me, greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, and then put a sign that said it was closed right on the door behind me. "What are you doing?" I asked, and he replied with a nervous smile. "I made sure we had the place all to ourselves. You're not going to tell my boss, are you?" At another time, I would have thought that was cute in a way, but there was just something about his attitude that struck me as very odd, and suddenly I noticed that the cafeteria was completely empty, meaning not only no customers, but no employees either. The machines were working, but there was no one serving coffee or in the kitchen, nothing. At that moment, I understood that he worked there and had opened it just to receive me. As I told you before, at another time that would have seemed like a nice gesture on his part. But in this case, and after all the context of the situation, this was definitely a red flag, but it was already there. And besides, it was Phil. I had nothing to fear, I thought. We sat down at a secluded table, and as soon as he opened his mouth, I knew something was wrong. He started looking at me with no expression on his face, his eyes empty and his words seemed to be meaningless. He was talking to me as if no time had passed, as if we were still a couple and this was just a random date. I tried to keep calm, reasoning with him and explaining that everything was over between us and that I needed him to leave me alone, but apparently he didn't want to listen. On the contrary, Phil. He was clinging to the idea that we could still be together, that we were meant for each other, that he had already changed his negative things and a lot of other things. Like our love was indestructible and now no one could ever separate us. And it was right at that moment when the situation really became unsettling, as he started talking about how we would be together forever, and that he would do whatever it took to keep us together, even if it meant hurting others. I told Phil I had to leave because I had to run an errand with my mother and he was waiting for me, but when I tried to leave, he stepped forward and blocked my way. Now Phil was standing in front of me, a crooked smile on his face and an intensity in his eyes that chilled my blood. "You can't escape us. We'll always be together, in life and in death, remember," he said. This was something we used to say, more by way of a joke when we were together. It was actually a line we heard in a movie and played at saying this to each other when we were a couple, but it clearly wasn't something to take so seriously. Without thinking, I bolted for the exit, screaming and yelling for help, but the cafeteria door was locked, and worse, I realized there was no one around. Then the inevitable happened. I felt an icy hand on my shoulder that stopped me dead in my tracks, and as I turned around, shaking with nerves, there were Phil's empty eyes, staring at me with terrifying intensity. "I told you you couldn't escape true love," he whispered. And in the blink of an eye, I felt a wet handkerchief pressed to my nose. And at that moment I realized this was not going the right way. I immediately began to feel dizzy, and everything went black. When I came to my senses, I found myself in a dark, dank room with a steady drip of water echoing around me. The place was filthy, and the walls were moldy. I tried to move, but realized I was tied to a chair, with rough ropes holding me immobile, and there was Phil in front of me, with that unhinged look I didn't recognize in him, holding a gun in his hand. "Welcome to our home, Tammy. It still has a few repairs to go, but together we'll make it a beautiful place," he said, and my stomach sank. I tried to scream, to fight, but it was all in vain. I felt completely trapped, at the mercy of a guy who had lost his mind. At that, Phil approached me, and passing the gun along the edge of my face, he told me in a sweet voice that he would not use it, that he would never hurt me, unless I wanted to escape, because in that case I would leave him no choice. Memories flood into my mind one after another, recalling that first day of my life with Phil. And now I get a little chuckle thinking about how scared I was, but slowly, over time, I began to realize that I was just being a little over the top, because he has actually been good to me. Remember I mentioned to you that I was living with my ex? Well, that's Phil, and now we're better than ever. I'm not saying the kidnapping thing was right, but in a way I feel grateful because it was the only way I found out that he was right all along, and that we are true love. A few years have passed, and surprisingly, no one has come to visit me. In the end, we did fix up the basement and made it a very cozy place. At first I was sad and scared, but now I see this as a blessing of sorts. Phil is an amazing man and always provides me with everything I need. I don't have to go out or meet more people. I don't need to, because he is all I want and all I need. He came in just now and asked me, "What are you doing, honey?" "Just writing another story," I replied. "Oh, great. You were always good at that. I'd love to read it when you're done." "Of course, love. But do you think I could go for a walk for a while? I feel like getting some fresh air." Her reaction was immediate. "You know I can't let you go out. If I did, people would realize that we are here, in this abandoned place. And besides, you might escape. Neither of us wants that, do we?" "Sure," I said. "It's just that sometimes I'd like to see the world a little." But then Phil looked at me with a worried expression and said, "Honey, don't worry. I'm always here for you. You make me happy, and I want you to be happy too." God, I can't love him more. I have always lived in a small neighborhood, one of those where everyone knows each other and rumors run faster than a bullet. My neighbor, Sylvia, was a middle-aged woman, robust and very friendly. She lived alone, and although her house was always well kept, there was something that really made it special: the aroma of her freshly made homemade food, which permeated the air. Every evening I would sniff it, and I can't lie, I was envious of those lucky few who enjoyed her dishes. I had never tasted her food, but judging by how good it smelled, it should taste like paradise, and I couldn't help my mouth watering whenever I stuck my nose out and she was cooking. One day, on my way home from work, I saw her in the driveway of my building. She was carrying a huge basket full of ingredients she had just bought at the market, I assumed, so I decided to give her a hand, and the woman was very appreciative. "Jason, dear, thank you for helping me. My back is not what it used to be," she told me with a sweet smile. "By the way, tomorrow is cake baking day, and I'm thinking of making one that is my specialty, so I'd love for you to try it. Come over to my house tomorrow afternoon. What do you say?" It's hard for me to say no to an invitation, and this one would cost me twice as much, so I accepted right away. The next day, I arrived at her door at the appointed time, and Sylvia welcomed me with open arms, as if she had been waiting for me all my life. Her house was small and had a classic style that perfectly matched her personality. She was a couple of years older than me, but she had that air of a traditional woman that was reflected in everything she did, even in her house. The kitchen table was decorated with a huge cake in the center, and the aroma of butter and sugar enveloped the atmosphere. The aroma alone was already a delight. We sat down at the table and she served me the first slice, going on and on about the recipe and every detail, with a passion I had rarely seen in anyone. She said that cooking was her way of life, and that every dish she made was full of history and love, and I didn't doubt it. You don't know how much joy it brings me to cook for others, Jason. I think food is a way to show caring, and for me, it's the only thing I'm really passionate about, and also the only thing I have left. She started telling me about the pueblo where she was born, and how much she missed her family. But honestly, I was so dazed by the delicious aroma of the pie that I almost didn't pay attention. She served me, and I immediately took a bite. The cake was amazing, absolutely delicious, but there was something special, a texture that I couldn't identify. It wasn't unpleasant at all, just different. However, I didn't ask her anything, as she seemed so proud of her creation that I didn't want to bother her with questions. We continued chatting, and every now and then she would cut me another slice without my noticing. That cake I served you has a secret ingredient, something that makes it unique, she told me. I have to say that it was the best meal I had tasted in weeks, since after a while living alone, fast food had become my routine, and that afternoon with Sylvia reminded me of what a home-cooked meal really was. Time flew by, and by the time I realized it, the sun was beginning to set. It was already late, so I got up to thank her and say goodbye. But before I could take a step toward the door, Sylvia came up to me and said, "Jason, wait. I want you to try something special. I've been working on a little project and I think you're the perfect person for this." Her tone was so persuasive that I couldn't refuse. Then I watched her walk to the back of the kitchen, where she picked up a large knife she used to cut portions. "Relax. It's just one last slice," she told me as she served me another slice. But this time, the cake was different. It had a darker color and a more intense aroma, something almost metallic. Sylvia sat across from me, still holding the knife, watching me carefully. I picked up my fork and took a bite, but the taste was different, much stronger than before, and my stomach churned a little, but I tried to remain calm. She kept looking at me and finally broke the silence. "It's funny, isn't it? People never wonder where things come from. They just eat what's in front of them, like you, who didn't ask any questions." At that moment I swallowed saliva, not knowing what to answer. Human blood is complicated to cook, but when you manage to get it right, the result is indescribable. I laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke, but something in his gaze told me there was something fishy going on here. "You're kidding, right?" I said in an amused tone. "Inside the cake is blood?" "No, that's not it. The secret ingredient is a little cinnamon. But this time it's different. The cinnamon is strong, but not strong enough to hide the taste of human blood." "What are you trying to tell me?" I asked, feeling the air around me grow thicker. "Everything I've eaten so far is made of blood?" Sylvia smiled as she said, "Blood from people like you, who I've invited into my home. People who tasted my food and then became part of it. Almost poetic, don't you think?" My body immediately tensed. The knife in his hand seemed more menacing now that I understood what he was implying. Everything I had eaten was... No, it couldn't be true. When he mentioned blood, everything I had consumed was beginning to churn in my stomach and I was now deeply nauseous. I tried to hold back, but I couldn't take it anymore, so I leaned forward and began to vomit with brutal force. The bitter taste of what came out of my body reminded me of what I had heard. Human blood. My throat burned and my heart was beating so fast I could barely think. Then Sylvia looked at me with an eerie calm. "Oh, Jason, don't worry about it, dear. They all react the same way." My head was spinning. I was very confused. I didn't know if it was panic, disgust, or a sudden dizziness clouding my vision, but then I remembered that I'd had tea before the cake. Was there something wrong with the tea? My limbs seemed heavy as lead. I tried to get up, but my legs were unresponsive. Meanwhile, Sylvia stood there with a steady smile, then began to move slowly toward me. She pulled a handkerchief soaked in some liquid from her pocket and said to me, "Don't worry, honey. This won't hurt. You'll just go to sleep for a little while." Panic washed over me like a wave, and with the little strength I had left, I tried to push his hand away from my face, but my movements were clumsy, useless. The intense smell of the chemicals was consuming me, and my vision began to blur completely. There I lost my balance and fell off the chair, making a thud as I hit the floor. "Will you go now, honey?" he was saying with a really sinister smile. I was feeling terrible. It wasn't just the vomit or the disgust of having eaten something so horrible. It was clear that something was really weakening me. With a last-ditch effort, I lunged forward, hitting the furniture in my path as I tried to escape, even though I knew I couldn't run and wouldn't get very far. Then I saw the knife rise and my instincts screamed at me to move. With a rush of adrenaline, I threw myself to the side just in time, rolling on the ground as the knife buried itself in the wooden floor where it was only a second before. The force of her attack gave me a minimal advantage. Sylvia was a sturdy woman, and although she was tall and her very build was strong, this also made her slow, and her imbalance allowed me to get up awkwardly and make a staggering run for the window, where I threw myself with all my might against the glass, making it explode into 1,000 pieces around me. I fell on the other side with a crash and felt the glass cut my skin, but that pain was the only thing that kept me awake. I fell into the front yard of Sylvia's house, and to my luck, I saw that it was still daylight, but the light was beginning to fade, so I knew I didn't have much time. I turned around and saw Sylvia leaning out the window, looking at me unhurriedly, with the knife still in her hand, so I crawled for what seemed like a kilometer, although it was probably only a few meters, until a neighbor came out, concerned about the noise. With my vision blurred, I noticed that the world around me was getting darker and darker, but the neighbor helped me as best he could and took me to his house. Everything was confusing. I remember trying to tell him what had happened, but I was so dazed and numb, I don't even know what words came out of my mouth. What I do remember clearly is hearing him call 911. After that, everything was a blur. I remember feeling movement around me, but I couldn't react. My body was unresponsive and everything went completely dark. I woke up hours later in a hospital, my head still spinning, and the doctor rushed over and said, "Open your eyes. You are fine. We found a very strong drug in your system, but fortunately you threw up most of it. Thank God, because if you hadn't, that substance could have killed you. What happened to you? Did someone give you something to drink?" he asked. Then everything came to me all at once. The tea Sylvia served me that afternoon was adulterated. That paralyzed me, and then she wanted to finish knocking me out with the chloroform. Sylvia was immediately arrested and didn't even bother to hide her resignation. She was at her trial as the main witness, and the policeman commented that this woman had killed many people in the small Swedish town where she was originally from, and continued to do so when she came to the United States. Sylvia had moved 4 times to small towns in various parts of the country, and coincidentally, in all the places where she had lived, people had been reported missing. Now they knew it was her, and worse, now they knew what happened to those poor souls. Hi, I'm Vanessa, and I'm 20 years old. What I am about to tell you is undoubtedly the craziest experience I have ever lived. It happened a couple of years ago, but it still gives me chills to remember it. It all started one night when I was walking home from dinner at a restaurant with one of my friends. It was late summer, and the air was already starting to cool down, so I was a little uncomfortable from the cold. I know you might wonder why a young girl would walk alone in the middle of the night, especially as dangerous as things are these days. But believe me, I didn't have anything expensive on me. My phone was a geezer, my wallet was empty, and my outfit screamed "poor thing" with every step, so I wasn't afraid of being mugged. Besides, I'd been taking karate lessons for several years, so I thought I could defend myself pretty well if something went wrong. Although, to be honest, that night I wasn't even paying attention. I was so distracted trying to figure out if my clothes smelled bad that I ran headlong into someone without realizing it. I immediately excused myself when I realized it was a girl. She looked a couple of years older than me, and when she saw me, her face lit up with surprise. I asked her if she was okay, and she introduced herself as Lena. Then, out of nowhere, she started telling me that I looked super cool and that my accessories were really nice. Really? I was dressed in a plain white t-shirt, dark jeans that came down to my sneakers, and a light coat because of the cold, but believe me, everything I had on was worth less than the dinner I had just eaten. I didn't understand how that seemed attractive to him, but what do I know? To each his own. I barely responded with a shy, "Thank you," as I scratched my arm, but that's when I realized that the way she was talking gave me a bad feeling. She seemed to have had a couple of drinks, because her tongue was a little heavy, and I couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. Lena didn't seem dangerous, at least not at first. However, I didn't feel entirely comfortable with her either. She asked me if I wanted to accompany her home, but I didn't dare accept, and told her maybe another time. I didn't know if I wanted anything to be misunderstood, although I was open to making new friends. But it was just then that everything turned into chaos. Just as we were exchanging our contact numbers, I noticed something strange behind Lena. But before I could do anything, a huge guy in a hoodie, dressed completely in black and with his face covered, appeared. In his hand he was carrying a knife, and at that moment my heart stopped. Then Lena realized the situation, and her expression changed from surprise to terror. But before she could react, the guy grabbed her arm and plunged the knife into her. The man brutally slashed her right arm as if it were a piece of chicken, and the sound of the blow as her arm fell to the ground was horrifying. At that moment, my instinct screamed at me that I had to act, and fast. The guy luckily hadn't seen me, so I lunged at him and knocked him to the ground. I remember hitting him repeatedly, getting him to drop the huge knife and throwing it away. The guy was bleeding from the nose and clearly wasn't expecting me to confront him. I immediately told Lena that she needed to come with me and offered her my house as a safe haven to hide from the guy and call 911. So realistically, even though I had just cut his arm off, he wasn't even crying, screaming in pain. It seemed like all the alcohol he had been drinking was serving as a painkiller, and we soon started running. We shot down the street, while looking back every few minutes, fearing that the guy was following us. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I felt that every step was crucial. We finally arrived at my house, and just as we entered, I noticed my parents were there. They looked at us confused and frightened by the situation. I quickly tried to explain to them that they had to call the police and gave them the address of the place of the attack, which luckily I still remembered. It wasn't long before an ambulance arrived at the house, and in the meantime, the guy who attacked us was found lying unconscious near the scene, with all the evidence of what he had done right there. The police soon arrived and were able to piece together the puzzle of what had happened very quickly. In the end, Lena was taken to the hospital, and I was thankful that it hadn't been worse than it already was. Shortly after that incident, I learned that Lena was in recovery. Miraculously, the cops managed to recover her arm and the doctors sewed it back on. And while it was very likely that she would never regain full mobility of it, in addition to having to deal with a huge scar at the site of the surgery, at least she had her arm back on her body. Later, I learned that this guy was Lena's ex-boyfriend, who had sworn revenge on her after she confessed to him that she was a lesbian and left him to be with a girl. Although we met in a terrifying situation, Lena and I became very good friends after that, and we are to this day. She was a strong and determined girl, and to my surprise, she even started taking karate classes to feel more confident. I always comment on it, but sometimes life throws unexpected situations at you. I learned that it is crucial to be alert and careful, especially at night. I never thought I would have to fight for another person's life, let alone someone I had just met. That's why I always tell people to be aware of their surroundings and, if possible, carry something to defend themselves. In the end, what matters is that both Lena and I made it out of that terrible night. Now, considering that the experience could have gone very wrong, I am more aware of my surroundings. Remember, in the outside world, things can change in the blink of an eye. So stay safe, folks. Life is full of surprises, and some of them are very scary. Before social media came out and took over our lives, making new friends was a real challenge. I often found myself seeing amazing girls on the street, but never had enough courage to approach them and get to know them. In those days, to socialize, you had to juggle with more complex methods, to say the least. But then came Facebook, that new platform where you could make friends and gossip about whatever you wanted to know about someone, just by clicking add. Truth be told, what I thought would be a fun experience turned out to be something that changed my life completely. I'm Mason, and this happened to me in 2007. By that year, Facebook had only been out in the world for a couple of years, but it was already taking the world by storm. At first, I wasn't too convinced to join. I wasn't a fan of sharing my life online. Eventually, however, I gave in and created my account. The first few profiles that popped up were all of people from New York, and I spent quite a while flipping through their photos, wondering if I should add any of them. But that's when I saw a girl named Mabel. She was absolutely beautiful. But what really got me was her profile. It was filled with photos of her and her friends partying, traveling, and generally enjoying life to the fullest, something I didn't do too much of, but I liked people who did. So after thinking about it for a few minutes, I finally sent her a friend request. Within a few hours, she had already accepted my request and sent me a message. "Hi, it's Mabel." And from there the conversation flowed pretty well. Mabel had a very relaxed vibe. Now that I think about it, I think that relaxed tone was easier because we were behind a screen. We talked for a week, where she asked me a lot of questions about my life and my past, and in the end, I decided to take the plunge and propose to meet her in person. I asked him, "Would you like to meet sometime?" "Sure," she replied. "Where would you like to go?" I asked back, but she told me to take my pick, so I proposed dinner the next day, and she told me she was out of town, but was coming back just a day later. I couldn't believe my good luck, so we agreed to meet then. The next day I arrived at the restaurant we had chosen, but she still hadn't arrived, so I decided to text her and ask her if everything was okay. She replied, "Everything's fine. I'm on my way. I'm just running a little late." I didn't want to pressure her, so I told her that nothing was wrong. I waited about 10 more minutes, and suddenly I saw her approaching. The first thing I noticed when Mabel arrived was that, in person, she looked quite different from how I remembered her in her profile. Let's just say that in person, she looked thinner, not as attractive, and had dark circles under her eyes that she tried to hide with a lot of makeup. She came over, sat down at the table, and smiled at me. "Hi," she said. I smiled back and replied, "You look tired. Are you sure you're okay?" She just laughed as she flipped through the menu and called the waiter over. Mabel had that same relaxed vibe she displayed online. I talked to her a lot that night, but I couldn't shake the impression that something wasn't quite right. So, at one point I asked her, "Are you sure everything's okay? If you don't feel ready for this, I can take you home." She took a moment to look down at her food before looking up and saying, "I like the idea of going to your house better," as she gave me a smile. I didn't need much more to agree, so we paid the bill and headed to my apartment, chatting as we walked. Once inside, I told her to make herself comfortable while I made her a drink. I made her a gin and tonic, and returned to the living room to find her standing, fiddling with her thumbs as if she was nervous. Then I said, "Look, you said it's all right, but are you really okay?" She was silent for a moment, and then shook her head and said, "Mason, you're a good guy, but if we're going to take it a step further, there's something you need to know." I approached her, a little nervous about what she was going to tell me. "You've probably noticed by now that I look different than I did in the profile. It's been a while since I've been active on that account because I've been really sick and life has been a mess for me. I don't know how much time I have left." She was crying now, and all she could think about was how her profile had created a totally different picture of her. Mabel continued, "My family tells me it's not the end and that I should keep trying, and that's why I accepted your application. I don't want you to get your hopes up." As she continued to cry, I reached out and hugged her. She was so close now, and her warmth and scent were so pleasant that I didn't want to let go. "It's all right, Mabel," I said softly, as I stroked her cheek. "No silly disease should take someone as beautiful as you. That wouldn't be fair." At that moment, she tried to let go of the hug, but I held her close to my chest. "I really never thought it would be so easy to bring a beautiful girl like you here to my house. You see, it's usually chaos to follow them around and get an excuse to lure them into my car and have her crying or screaming all the time besides." At that moment, her expression was one of incomprehension and fear, something I had not seen from her before. She tried to hit me, but it was useless. I held her tightly and took her to the couch. Then she started screaming, and that really irritated me. So I grabbed her by the neck and said, "Stop screaming, Mabel. Now you won't have to worry about how many more days you have left." Her struggle continued, but it didn't last long. In less than a minute, she passed out, and that made it easier for me later. So there you have it, officer. That was my first experience with Facebook. I told the officer as he questioned me in the courtroom after my last friend ran off on me and went mouthy to the police. "You're a sicko, Mason, and I'll make sure you spend the rest of your days behind bars," the officer said. "Say what you want, but if you ask me, I didn't do anything wrong. I just asked to be her friend and she agreed. All she wanted was some girlfriends," I told him. "You molested and killed 18 women using Facebook, Mason, and God knows how many before that. And you say you just wanted girlfriends? Well, you won't worry about that anymore, because pretty soon you'll know what happens to the likes of you in prison. I'm sure more than one would like to be your friend," he said. "I guess it's no good, but what's done is done." I recently moved to a small town in England from the United States to finish my degree. I am a third-year engineering student at MIT, and hearing this, you may be wondering why an MIT engineer would leave an Ivy League university to move overseas. Well, I have a story to tell. 3 years ago, I was admitted to MIT for a 4-year engineering program, and there I met Sabrina, a stunning blue-eyed, dark-haired girl that everyone commented on. At first, we had no relationship, but as the first year progressed, Sabrina and I became good friends. It was weird for me, because I never thought a girl like her would want to be around a nerdy boy like me. I don't know what attracted her, but she liked hanging out with me. I came from a humble family. My mom worked at a local store and my dad was a church pastor, so in my life, I had always been a bit weird, with only a couple of friends who were just as shy and studious, and that's because even my sister called me antisocial. So when Sabrina started wanting to spend time with me, I felt on top of the world. We teamed up on class projects, studied together, and turned in assignments as a pair of inseparable friends. Everyone looked at me as if they were impressed that she and I had become so close. As time went on, I realized that Sabrina was not only beautiful, but also super smart. As early as sophomore year, she surprised me by asking me out for the first time as a date. I promise you I was on cloud 9. I had never been on a date before, let alone with someone so amazing. My parents were thrilled when I told them, so we started dating, and by the middle of sophomore year, we were the most popular couple on campus. One night, while we were studying in the library, she asked me, "What do you think about living together?" We were both in dorms, and honestly, the situation wasn't ideal. My roommate was a mess and snored like a bear, so I replied, "I'm more than willing." Plus, my roommate partied almost every night, so living together would be a huge relief. From that point on, we started looking for a place, and to our surprise, we found a lovely apartment just a short walk from the university. When we finally moved in, I felt like all my wishes were coming true. I will be living with my girlfriend, so life was great. On our first night in the new place, just as we were getting settled, Sabrina got all dressed up and ready to go. "Where are you going?" I asked her. She got a little nervous, and after a silence, she clarified. "I never told you this, Jacob, but I come from a pretty strict Catholic family. Ever since I was little, my parents and I would go to Mass, and here I found out that a local priest organizes night masses, so every night after dinner I go there. I hope you don't mind. I grew up in a Christian home. As I told them, my dad was a pastor in a church, so it was no problem for me. "I don't mind at all. Do what you want, Sabri," I replied, although I also wondered if it would make sense to accompany her or let her go alone. "Do you want me to come with you? Is it safe to be out this late?" I asked. "What time will you be back?" "Don't worry, I'll be back before 12:30. If I get lonely, I'll call you," she said as she prepared to leave. The church wasn't too far away, just a few blocks, so we had a quick kiss, and after he left, I stayed in the apartment to watch Netflix. The next morning when I woke up, Sabrina was already in the kitchen making breakfast. I must have overslept because I didn't remember seeing her come back. Over the next few months, we established a routine. Every night she would attend that nightly mass, which I honestly had no idea such a mass existed, and I would stay home to wait for her. One day while on the phone with my mom, I mentioned that Sabrina went to a night mass almost every day. My mom was silent for a moment. "Mom, can you hear me?" Yes, Jacob, I hear you. It's just a little confusing to me. I don't know if churches have night mass. People are usually busy, I don't know. It seems weird." My mother kept talking, but I was just holding back how strange the whole situation seemed to me. Sabrina had always been trustworthy, but now my mother's words made me question it. She had been in a church all her life, just like Dad, so she knew a thing or two about how those things worked. I tried asking Sabrina about those nightly masses, but every time I did, she would only give me short answers and seemed to get uncomfortable if I went too deep. Another weird thing was that I could never stay awake until she came back. I would always fall asleep shortly after she left the house, as if something was preventing me from doing so. For that reason, at the end of our second year, I decided that I had to follow Sabrina secretly to see what she was really doing. The night I made up my mind, I followed her thinking she was just going to church. She did indeed go to church, and that gave me some relief. But then I noticed that instead of going in the front door, she detoured and snuck into a small entrance. That struck me as odd, so I followed her and went in as well. I went down some long stairs and eventually came to a crypt. There were at least a dozen young girls there, all as pretty as Sabrina. I felt a little uncomfortable and hid behind a pillar to observe what was going on. But instead of praying, they were all standing in a circle around an inverted pentagram. My heart immediately skipped a beat at the sight, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about my girlfriend was shaken. What was really going on here? The candles were lit, and suddenly they all started chanting something, probably in Latin or Greek. Then a young woman who looked no more than 25 years old stepped into the circle and began to speak. The things I heard made me want to vomit and cry at the same time. I had no intention of staying to watch the whole ritual, so I decided to leave and go home. When I arrived, I packed up the essentials and went back to my dorm room. It was clear to me that Sabrina would come looking for me, but I didn't want to hear from her anymore. I called my mom and told her everything I had witnessed, and she became concerned and asked me to come home immediately. So the next morning, before Sabrina could reach me, I took the first flight back. However, as soon as I arrived, I started to feel sick. I got a horrible fever that wouldn't let me rest. The priest revealed to me that Sophia was 157 years old and was a witch who used kids like me to keep herself young and healthy. That was exactly what the cult leader was talking about in the crypt that night before I left. She was slowly sucking the life out of me, and had I stayed with her any longer, I might have ended up dead by the time my 4th year came around. I had already been kicked out since I started living with her. It all made sense. That's why I was always so tired at night and couldn't remember when I came back. The priest blessed me with some holy water and advised me to leave the country for a while, as the cult didn't let their victims leave so easily. So as soon as I recovered, I moved to England to continue my studies, hoping that Sabrina and her strange cult wouldn't follow me.